I guess I should welcome you again to what has become Focus Week, on our way to Focus Month. So we can just keep doing these kinds of things and kind of exploring outside our normal routine, which is really part of what I'm interested in exploring today. My name is John Hawthorne. I am chair of the sociology department. This is my third year at Spring Arbor University. This is my 32nd year in Christian higher education, my fifth institution. So I've been thinking about these kinds of things and playing with this for a long time. I will mention coming up here in a minute that this talk has a lot to do with, it arises out of a book I just finished that actually is like, I'm going to get the actual hard copies in the mail today. So I was hoping they'd come yesterday so I could hold it up. But I'm been thinking about this for a long time, and so what I really want us to explore together is this notion of the work of learning, and work I should probably put in quotes, of learning. But it's really like how to make the most out of what's going on in terms of your own college experience. And so I'm going to spend most of my time on that. I hope to do this, but my plan is to get through my presentation in about 40 minutes. And then we can spend 20 minutes or so kind of talking about what that meant and what you do with it and what you like and don't like and agree with and don't agree with and where your questions are and all those things. So we're really looking at the question about what I call the work of learning. Now I thought I'd really begin, maybe, I would begin by telling you that this talk is not about the relationship between learning and jobs. Right? The work of learning is not about learning is about jobs. But that is so much in the media. In fact, I just this morning, half an hour ago, was looking at a Gallup survey that was done of employers that said that some small percentage of them strongly agree that that college graduates could have the skills necessary for their businesses. I would just say it's a lousy survey, and it's even though it's Gallup, it's consistent with a whole lot of other things. Right? So there are scary claims out here about the fact that college isn't worth it. That are you sure it's really worth all the time and money? That student loan debt is bigger than you'd ever imagined it before. And my favorite, the growth of college grads in dead-end jobs in two graphs, the rise of the baristas. This is the dominant story in today's news about higher education. It feeds fears about higher education costs. It feeds fears about debt. It raises all these questions about, is it worth it? Does it matter? So even though it's not what I want to talk about, I want to take a couple of minutes and put to rest this question. Right? So the reality is very different. This is a story, and if you write me, I can give you all the links to this stuff. But I just clipped headlines. This is a story from the New Republic from 2011, why the media is always wrong about the value of a college degree. It's a wonderful article. It talks about why it is they in the media, in the public, get this information wrong all the time. What they focus on, why they ask the wrong questions. Right? So here's a study that just came out this month, actually, from the American Association of Colleges and Universities. And it says that according to their research, liberal arts disciplines prepare, so that's like schools like ours. Liberal arts disciplines prepare graduates for long-term professional success. That while there may be a short-term benefit for people in engineering and sciences and things among first jobs, over the life of over the course of a decade, that actually liberal arts graduates catch up and do quite well. Actually, over the life of the career, pass a little bit. Right? So that's good news. Right? This, by the way, is the underemployment thing about the rise of the baristas. And this is kind of related to the fact that while it's true that recent college graduates kind of dipped down and went back up again when you look at a 22-year period in terms of what they called underemployment, it's actually, because I teach statistics, it's actually a fairly stable curve. Yeah? And it's stable for all college graduates, regardless of how old they are. And it got a little better for college graduates around the turn of the millennium, and then it went back up again. But it went back up to where it was in the 90s. So we make too much of these stories, right? Here's where the real story comes in. Right? This is this is data from the Pew Research Institute that came out this year in 2014 about the disparity among people ages 25 to 32 about college education. The real story is not that college isn't worth it. The real story is the high school diploma has diminishing returns. Right? The high school diploma alone, you can see, shows in that top figure about a $14,000 gap. That's like half the $28,000 in terms of earnings, in terms of average earnings. That their unemployment rate is considerably higher than the national average, that their likelihood of living on poverty is considerably higher than the national average. So, and this is just among the millennials. This is not about older people who didn't think it was important to have college degrees. So, part of what we're doing here is recognizing that the college degree is actually quite important to your life relative to where you came, from where you came. Right? In fact, I've got data from a study of some economists did a couple of years ago that I put in my book. Oh, it wasn't supposed to go that fast. A story from my book that shows the gap between a bachelor's degree there, and a high school degree here. I'm sorry for this. For men, it's $1 million. Over the course of the lifetime, it's $1 million. For women, it's $800,000. I can't really explain why it's only $800,000 for women. That's bothering. But it's $1 million. Right? So, for those who say, is college worth it? It's worth $1 million. Right? So, just when people say, is it really worth the investment or anything else, just tell them, it's $1 million. Right? Okay. But really, this question about money and earnings is the wrong question. Because the question that I'm really wanting to focus on is this notion of what's happening when you're here. How do we understand what you're doing here as part of work? So it's not about money, it's about what are you doing while you're here. And that's the cover of my book, just in case you needed a commercial. That's the cover of my book, A First Step into a Much Larger World, the Christian University and Beyond, which is written for freshmen entering Christian universities. So this is kind of unpacking all of those things. Let me catch up. So this is really where I want to spend my time today. That's like all I want to say about jobs and money and other kinds of stuff. I want to talk about what the issues are in terms of people coming to college. And this notion of jobs is in the back of your mind, but I think it's not the real challenge that we have before us. Right? The real problem we have in terms of higher education is this bureaucratic notion about why we're in college. And by bureaucratic, I mean we simply focus on a bunch of things we have to do. What do I have to do to get 124 credits in my major with the right number of grades in the right configuration of courses with enough satisfactory grades to earn me credits that I can cash in the registrar's office, that when I'm done with all that stuff, we get 124 credits and you get to walk across the platform and shake hands with the president and the chairman of the board of trustees, and they hand you an empty shell that eventually you'll be able to turn in for your diploma. But that's the deal, right? Now, this is not your fault. it is not your fault that we tend to approach this as a bureaucratic exercise where we have to jump through a bunch of hoops to get education done. In part, we've been doing that to you for the whole time you've been in school, except for those of you who are homeschooled. We've focused on checking off boxes and passing tests and standardization and all that kind of stuff. Right? But we do it here too. Right? I know you can't read that. You don't need to. That's one page out of our catalog that I'm sure you've memorized it. This is the page out of the catalog that lists some of the general education requirements for Spring Arbor University. And it pretty much says right there, take one of these and take one of those and check off this box and do another one of those over there. And that's the nature of the way we pitch it. Right? That's what things look like in terms of processing through an institution and being part of school. But it's still the wrong answer. It's a better answer than how much money is it worth, but it's not really the right answer. The right answer is about this one. It's the personal answer. What's happening to you? How are you doing the work of learning to use what you have before you in a constructive manner to help prepare yourself for who knows what's coming down the road in your future? Right? It may be jobs, it may be other kinds of things, but it's really about your work, and that's where I want to focus my time today. So what we're really doing is we're practicing vocation. Vocation isn't about that thing you're going to do eventually. Vocation is about who you are now and how you're giving life to that. So I illustrate that. This is stolen from a friend of mine that I taught with in Portland. And his response to the bureaucratic argument was to say, really, if you needed 124 credits, that a student needed to think of that. He called the student Larry. That Larry needed to understand Larry was taking 41 courses in Larry. They're not all 3-credit classes. It's actually more than 41, but it's not worth it. So taking 41 classes in Larry, because each class provides an opportunity for Larry to learn a little more about himself, about his limits, about his skills and abilities, to find a tidbit of information that connects to other information that is useful to him in the long run in his own personal growth and development, in his own pursuit of God's calling. That's what 41 courses in Larry is all about. This is the best ever quote, one of the best ever quotes from Frederick Buechner, that many of you probably heard if you've been in any kind of lecture about vocation, but it's so good it's worth sharing every time you get a chance. He says, by and large, a good rule for finding vocation is this: the kind of work God usually calls you to is the kind of work, A, that you need most to do, and B, that the world most needs to have done. That orientation is part of what the work of learning is about. It's about trying to see how you use what you're learning, what you're experiencing, into some larger package in terms of what it is that your role is in the world. Now, in doing that, and in working through my book, I've looked at a number of issues in terms of the nature of learning. So one book that's really helpful to me was this book. There are actually 2 books that this guy wrote. Ken Bain is the provost at the University of District Columbia. He wrote one book called What the Best College Teachers Do, which was very good, and then he followed it with a book called What the Best College Students Do. And it just so happens that there are 2 fish bowls and fish on his thing too, and it made me just so. I did not steal this. No. My publishers did the cover design, and I like it, but I didn't show them this one and said, isn't this cool? Can we do this? So it just happens that the fish is there. Okay. So he talks about 3 kinds of learning. The first he calls bulimic learning. Okay? I could go into lots of detail about why he calls it bulimic learning. Let me just say that what that is a student learns what's necessary for this particular moment, and the minute that moment, that exam, that course, something is over, one empties oneself of that knowledge and gets ready for the next thing. Right? So I could elaborate, but it's disgusting, so I won't. Right? The second approach that he talks about is strategic learning. And when I first read it, I was struggling with the word strategic here because we tend to think of strategic as a good thing. But he says strategic learners are all about gaming the system. They're all about figuring out what one has to do for the grade. So a strategic learner will come to a class and we'll look at the syllabus and we'll talk to people about other people who've had Dr. Hawthorne before, and we'll say, so what does he look for in exams? And what do I have to do? And in his papers, does he grade for this or does he grade for that? And not you, others, not you, wind up looking at these issues as a means of saying, how do I play this game to get the grade that I'm after? Right? I don't really need to learn. I need to do what Dr. Hawthorne needs me to do to get the grade that I want. Right? That's a strategic learner. Then he talks about deep learning. And deep learning, of course, anytime you set up a trio like this, the third one is the one we're looking at. We dismissed the first two. It rarely is that you put the really important point in the middle. So deep learning, we're really taking steps toward long-term goals of understanding and development. Right? So deep learning is probably closest to this notion of 41 classes in Larry. How is it that each one of those experiences takes you someplace that's useful? Here's how he describes it. Deep learners, which, by the way, includes a chapter on Stephen Colbert as a deep learner. It's a very good chapter. He says, deep learners pursue the development of the dynamic power of the mind, and that end, not academic honors or simply surviving college, became their primary goal. They came to understand themselves better, and out of those insights to appreciate the unique qualities and experiences that they could bring to any project. In turn, the more they understood about themselves, the greater confidence they had, and the more they appreciated the special qualities and achievements of everyone else. They became students of other people's histories in the sciences, humanities, and arts. Most important, they found a way to motivate themselves to work. So by going kind of inside and seeing how this deep learning works, we begin to understand that this whole exercise of learning takes on a different value. A value that, by the way, will lead to both the job and to the credential and to checking off all the right boxes. Right? You start here, and the rest of it plays out. Okay. So what does this look like? I want to unpack, in the time that I have left, 4 different kinds of work. I should have come up with a better third title, since the work of learning and learning work is kind of weird, but I go back through it. I was struggling with that one. I would talk about what's going on mentally, the cognitive work that you do, your personal work that you do, what learning actually engages, the kind of orientation one takes to learning, and I'm going to wrap up by talking about the role of learning in the kingdom of God and college's kingdom of God. Okay? So that's where I'm headed. Okay, so mental work. For mental work, we recognize that you are all involved in change and transition. Not just because you're in college, but because of where you are in life. Right? This happens to be stuff that if you've had education courses or psychology courses you've seen before. Certainly you've seen the one on the left, which is Jean Piaget's Stages of Cognitive Development. The one on the right is James Fowler's Stages of Faith Development that Fowler, who was a professor at Emory University, theologian / psychologist, developed out of Piaget's thinking about how we understand faith and how faith changes through the aging process, through the developmental process. I could do lots, tempted to do lots more detail than I ought to do here. Let me just tell you that, for my judgment, part of the coming to college, the moving from home to the new place, even the transition of what you're learning along the way, is part of the shift in Piaget terms from concrete operational to formal operational learning. You are changing the way you learn during this time period when you're in college. Some of you do it faster than others. Some of you came already formal operational thinking. Some of you lagged behind that. Not you, but the other people who are in other rooms. We're at different developmental stages, and you need to know where you are. That this is part of the how are we thinking kind of question. We tend to be, at this age, at your age, we tend to be kind of stuck somewhere between synthetic conventional faith and individual reflective faith. Stage 3 is where you're simply accepting kind of what's going on before you, what you've been given. You might try to fit a couple of things in that are new, but individual reflective, you can even see from the wording, is a far deeper sense of ownership as you're trying to think through things on your own. These are changes that are going on mentally during the time you're in college. So part of the work that I'm talking about is embracing those. The second thing is that we talk about is social psychologists talk about schemas and heuristics. That there's too much involved in understanding the world that we're part of, that we use shortcuts. We develop shorthand means of making sense of things, of ways of labeling things. Stereotypes are examples of schemas. Worldviews are examples of heuristics. And we work our way through those. The problem is that because those are easy and because they're ingrained, we can often be trapped by our own schemas and heuristics. We can be trapped into old ways of thinking, and we can view any new information as a threat. So, because I'm a social psychologist, I believe that meaning making is a central element of the human experience, especially during this transition that you're in from roughly about 18 to 30. It's really important that you're doing this mental work to make sense of what's happening around you, that you give yourself space to be able to struggle with ideas, to know that not everything is in concrete terms, and that ambiguity is not a frightening thing. It's the way to understand new meaning. Deep learning is always connected to meaning making. We are always trying to put things together in a larger and more robust picture of the world we live in, one that was better than the world we experienced a month ago. We're always incorporating new information and finding ways of connecting it. So that's the mental work. Here's what I'd share about the personal work. Okay? Two different kinds of things. They're very similar in their style. The first thing I want to talk about is multiple intelligences. This is the work of Howard Gardner at Harvard University, Project Zero. He's been doing for a few decades now. They've been fine-tuning this. And they list these 8 different forms of intelligence that people work through. The early work on multiple intelligences was in response to our heavy focus on certain skills of mathematical skills and linguistic skills that are tested with ACTs and SATs and GREs and all those kinds of things. And what he and his colleagues were able to demonstrate is that we actually think in a wide variety of manners, which include mathematical and linguistic, but are not limited to that. And he goes through these linguistic, logical, mathematical, spatial, musical, bodily, kinesthetic, natural, interpersonal, and intrapersonal. Now, what these are not about stuff. This is multiple intelligences is not about fields of study to Gardner. It's about how we learn. Right? So if you're somebody who has high degrees of natural intelligence, you can see the intricacies of you could see the intricacies of the biological world, of systems and subsystems, just naturally. You define the world in that way. You didn't have to learn about, all the kind of trees of species, phylums and species, genuses, and I'm getting them out of order, all that stuff, because your brain works that way. Right? I guarantee you, if we brought Dr. Baratovich down here, he would rank high, very high, on natural intelligence. I've heard him speak. I've seen him make those connections. Right? Okay, so the point is that this is not about stuff you learn about. It's really about how you learn. So some of this is about figuring out who you are and what works best for you. It doesn't mean that you say, I'm not strong in mathematical ability, so I don't have to do math. It says math intelligence isn't your natural language, and you have to find ways of translating from your natural language into math when you take math. Okay, so that's multiple intelligences, and all I want to share with you is it's good to know these things about how you learn and how your own brain works. It's not an excuse, it's a starting place. The other thing, I don't know if any of you have had experience, we've done a little bit around here with Strengths Quest. Strengths Quest is another Gallup operation. It's been going on for about 15 years, and in various forms. And what they do is they've got an evaluation you go through, and it shows that there are a number of strengths or talents that you have as an individual that is not shared by anybody else. Right? There are 34 different signature strains that they identify. You can figure out what your top 5 are, and these top 5 make you different than this other top 5. And I can tell you what the combinations are of the different ways you organize 34 themes in 5s. It's a bunch. Right? It's, your odds of being you is like 1 in 235,000, I think Garnet told me. Okay? So the point here is that we're doing this personal work to say, who am I? How do I function, and how does that interrelate with what I'm doing in school and how I'm preparing for where I'm going? Okay. Third, we've got issues about how we orient ourselves to learning. First of all, we have an issue that what we're looking at is actually learning that takes place inside and outside of class. In fact, I put together this chart in the book. If you add up all the hours in 4 years of college, 8 semesters at 15 and a half hours of credits, at an average assumption about how long you sleep a night and how many classes you took and all the rest of it, you spend about 10% of your time during college sitting in a room like this. Right? Theoretically, you spend another 30% asleep. Depends on where you are in the semester and which hall you're living in. And the balance of it, the other 60%, is all tied up in stuff that's not in class. It's your time. What I want to suggest for you is that learning takes place everywhere. And part of your orientation, part of the work of learning, is seeing that learning take place everywhere. You take what you've got in class, but it doesn't stop there, and it's not just there and homework. It's there and homework, and when you're driving and in a conversation with somebody, and at Mr. SAU, and at who knows what all of it is the raw material for learning. Okay, enough of that chart. So the process is that wherever we are trying to make sense not just of what we learn, but which pieces we're going to keep hold of. What are the pieces that you find yourself repeating to other people and say, I read this thing in this class. There was this one book I liked. Here was an idea that I find echoing in a variety of different places. And those are all kind of related to this notion about how we're taking what we're doing and we're making it part of that mental map, part of that understanding of our own meaning making, because it's connected in some ways to who we are and whose we are and where we're going. Right? So a hint about general education. Right? That's the Preservation Hall Jazz Band. So I had another friend in Portland, and I was talking to him once about, he taught jazz, and I was talking to him about how he set up a jazz program. You know, what did he do when he's going to do a performance? And he said, well, he's got a pretty good idea of the first number, and he's got a really good idea of the last number. And then he's trying to find ways of creating a natural flow throughout the program so that it leads smoothly from the first number through where he wants the program to end up. I want to challenge you to think about general education classes like a jazz concert. Okay? That each one is a little different, and each one has its own little riff, and each one has a different style, and you might not like the tonality of some of them, and you really got into the way that the string bass was doing in the other one. I don't want to go too far with this analogy either. But you're really kind of looking for the thread that runs throughout. If we look at general education back on, as we do on that page that I flashed up from the catalog, there's no reason to think any of it makes any sense at all. It's a bunch of stuff. If we're looking for a way that we're connecting threads throughout it, it becomes part of this personalized learning, part of the work of making this learning part of the meaning, part of the calling, part of the sense of direction. Okay? Okay, the next one is about the 40-year major. Whoops. The next one is about the 40-year major. So your major is not about this ticket to the job. It's not about what you do when you're 23 years old. Okay? Your major is really about what are you doing over 40 years. Okay? How is it that you're thinking about the kind of person you are, the direction you're headed, and the kind of arc your life is going to take? When that guy was sitting on that railing in 1975, did not know he was going to be standing here, did not know he was going to be a college professor at the time, but it is not surprising that I made that journey, that I've been preparing in some ways, in a variety of ways. I've been preparing for this moment for actually more than 40 years. But, I mean, no, I haven't. I've been preparing for longer than that picture. Okay? So this is part of the dynamic that we're really getting ready for life. We're not getting ready for the first job. We're not getting ready for what's after college. We're really getting ready for what's down the road. Right? Oh, there was another one in there. Finally, the point is to be able to tell your story. If you're going to do that, if you're going to connect the dots between these different segments of college life, these different classes, the different experiences you have, the intelligence, the rest of it, you need to be able to talk about that. I frequently have this conversation with students who are talking about what should they minor in, and what if they kind of took some class, they finished a course short of the minor. Will anybody care about their minor? The answer to the question is nobody cares about your minor. At least relatively speaking, nobody cares about your minor. What they care about is your ability to say, I took these other classes as well. I majored in this, but I really wanted to develop myself over here, and I took these other classes. Right? That's important. If you can tell that story, then you're not going to be one of those underemployed baristas. If you could tell that story, you could speak with confidence about what God is doing in your life and how it all seems to be leading toward this moment. Now, if you're going to do that over the long haul, you've got to practice it over the short run. And that means that at the end of every semester, I strongly recommend that you sit down and I don't know if you're a good journaler or not, or if you like kind of talking into your phone, or you just want to sit down with your parents. But every semester to be able to say, here's what I added this year. Here's what I picked up I didn't have before. Let me tell you what happened to me. Let me tell you how my skills have developed. About how I could speak in public in ways I never thought I could. About ways I understand this other thing in ways that I thought never made sense before. All of that seems to play out. And the more you tell your story, the better you get at telling your story, and the more internalized the story gets. That's part of the work of learning. Okay, we got to look at that picture again because I set it up to not disappear. Okay. Almost done. And I've got 2 minutes left. So, finally, the work we're doing is important because it connects to how we live. Right? If you're telling your story, if you're rehearsing your story, then part of what happens is it becomes part of your character. And it changes how you relate to other people. It changes how you think about things. It changes how you talk about things. It changes your values. It enriches your values. I talk about it as the kingdom of God because we talk here about the community of learners. But the kingdom of God is not this thing that's somewhere far away that we eventually hope will come to pass. I'm giving you the last chapter of the book. The kingdom of God is what we're doing right here, today. We are inhabiting the kingdom of God, and we are practicing the kingdom of God. And we'll be able to go forth from this place and impact the world because we've seen the kingdom of God at play. And what that means is that we are deeply, as a community of learners, we are deeply connected to one another. Right? So we tend to think about college life as being us and our group of friends, which is the picture on the left. This is sociology stuff about networks and strong ties and weak ties. I can tell you about later. But what we realize is that we're all really interconnected in ways far beyond what we think we are. So that means that if there's somebody that struggles in class near you, you're part of their story. And you have responsibility for their story. If you happen to have a friend who spends inordinate numbers of hours in the game room or milling around the DC for hours at a time, table hopping, you have a responsibility to help that person find some boundaries. To let them just drift and eventually kind of go away because they struggled at school, they struggled with the work of learning because they didn't get what we were talking about today. You own a little bit of that. Right? We all do. Okay? Because at the end of the day, learning in the Christian university is about practicing living in the kingdom of God. We're doing what we're called to do. We're trying to understand as deeply as possible to change our lives in ways that are consistent with that, and to be supportive of other people, sometimes even when they don't want to be supported, to be able to make those same transitions. That's pretty good. Okay? All right. So, one more slide. All right? So, over the course of my career, I've had this little speech that I give, not just this long speech, but a littler speech, that says, if you give me 30 students who really kind of get this in terms of what education could look like, I said, I can change the world. At least with 30 students, I can move an entire university. We could just transform how we think about learning and just leapfrog the institution into whole new arenas that we never thought were possible. And I was counting when I started, 3, 4, 8, 10, 16, 17, 25, 6, 7, 27. Almost there. We got to go find 3 more people and I can move the world. Right? There was one here who left, so I'm going to count her. and Robbie came in for a second and left. So that's 2 more. I'm at 29. I need 1 more person, and we'd have it, right? So that's my presentation. If we think about really moving learning to the front of what we do and making a part of personal identity and doing that work day after day, not just doing your homework, it's a level above that of doing your work, everything about higher education changes. And all the other stuff goes out the window, right? So that's my 41-minute talk. I want to hear from you. How would we start to do this? Or do we already do this fully and this was redundant? What do you think? Where do we go? Yes?
Well, first of all, what's the objective? Like, what are we trying to do?
Change the world.
Change the world?
Yeah.
How? Like, specifically?
How specifically to change the world? You have, okay, the objective is for learning to be about your preparation for your place in God's kingdom. Okay? You're already in God's kingdom and you already have your place in God's kingdom, but you are learning again and again and again how to do that and what that means more fully, more deeply, in more engaged fashion. And I want that for each one of you. Right? So how do we do that? How do we help that come about? And my fear is that we create all kinds of barriers that make it that's hard to do. So that's generally that's what I see as the end goal. Because I don't know if the only reason we do all this is so that we don't lose, to avoid the shortened income stream of high school diplomas and to be able to rack up just enough credits to limp across the platform and get a diploma, it does seem like an awful lot of money and time. Right? Yes?
Yeah, what do you think some of the flaws in our education system and our college systems, such as requirements and criteria to meet, have an impact on the deeper learning?
Okay, some of the challenges are presented by, and this could get me way down the road in terms of conversations we're having around here about whether we want to take a new look at general education kind of conditions stuff. Sometimes we operate in the world as if the most important thing is the 3-letter prefix at the beginning of a course. So if it says SOC in front of it, we don't care what the course is. You had to have a social science credit. Sociology is good as psychology or econ, so boom, there it goes. I really think that there are some courses that are better suited to that level of depth and engagement than others are. We were having a conversation the other day about the biology courses, and I think there's a difference between the environmental science course and some other courses because they open up those windows of being able to do that. So I think sometimes what I would do is I would actually have us focus a little more on what we're doing and why those courses are important. I think core here is very important in terms of the course sequence. Integrated sequences are really important in terms of communicating a mission of an institution. We could do a better job of spelling out the specific roles that a Core 3 plays regardless of who teaches it. That we probably have a little bit too much variability of professors, and there's a balance there between you want that kind of freedom and joy, but we got to work on that a little bit. Those are a couple of things. Third, there is a temptation for liberal arts colleges to make majors too organized around pre-professional experiences. So, we wind up saying, well, because they need to know these things when they get their first job, we start trying to teach all that, we cram it in, the major gets bigger, and then the number of classes that people could take outside their strength area goes down because the major got big, and between the major and general education, they run out of electives, or they're in a 5-year program, or something like that. That's a couple of 3 off the top of my head. What would you add?
I question the amount of workload of that. Not as much like the workload in the sense of like papers and tests and all this stuff. I think that that our idea of like we have this criteria to fit in to get a grade
Yes.
is not as important as the deeper learning and
Yes.
communication
Yes.
and the reading and the discussion that could happen deep in the understanding.
It would be to think about, and I've had this conversation in a few of my classes over the last year, to think about what would you do if you knew the grade was assured, the credit was assured, and what you were going to do is you were going to come every day, having read this material because you wanted to know about it, and to sit down and talk about it with your colleagues in class and with your professor who knows about it. And nobody was ever going to say, yeah, but do you remember that thing he said on page 43? I think the fear of what he said on page 43 is part of the crippling thing of what goes on with education. That I'm going to read this, but I'm not going to read it to kind of see what I think is interesting. I'm going to read it to guess what Dr. Hawthorne is going to think was important out of this chapter. And so then I don't really read it. I only read to do what I think I need to do to prepare. Yeah.
I guess my question is, how do you see like helping the students get from that like strategic learning and blameless learning to the deeper level of learning? Because I mean, there's the understanding of where they're at and knowing, okay, like I'm a strategic learner or something like that. But there's more than just being aware of it. There's actually like someone needs to help them get to that deeper learning.
I do not teach in the Core 1 program, but I really do believe that part of, I teach Core 4, but I do believe that, that especially for those people who've come out of public education and then come to college, you have spent 13 years with a particular bureaucratic form of education drilled into your brain. And I think the first thing we have to do is tell you not to worry about that. I think the first step we have to take is getting you to unlearn that stuff. I once argued that a college like you, how would you pitch, somebody asked me, how would you pitch a college like this to a 16-year-old? And my answer was, what would you do if you knew you could come and take classes in which your opinion mattered? As in which your contribution was part of the learning experience. Because I think we spent 12 years telling you that your role is to tell us what we already knew, to demonstrate that we measured it to the right level and that you are achieving at a certain level of mastery that we can check off on the boxes, because that's how we're demonstrating educational quality. And my measure of educational quality is really about where were you when you came in as a student, and where are you now when you graduated? That's why I do this for a living, by the way. There is nothing more enjoyable than seeing a freshman cross the platform and knowing what that person was like at 18 and seeing that person at 22, and the growth and the poise and the development and the character and all of that stuff. That's the joy in what we do. So at least speaking for me, I think I speak for most of my colleagues in that. So I think we have to begin by saying, let's unlearn this bureaucratic thing. That's the first move. The second move is to say, deep learning leads to grades. Right? It may take a while to get the hang of it. And so it may be that the A student in high school has to put up with some B's during the first year while they make that transition from gaming to deep learning. But I think one can do that, and so it becomes taking away the fear of not getting the grade. Right? That's a couple of thoughts. What else? Yeah.
So, as someone, I'm a biology student, so I have to do a lot of memorizing.
Get to.
I get to do a lot of memorizing. A lot of things that probably in the long run have nothing to do with anything that I could ever do. How do I put those two things together?
That's tough. And I'm not. I'm thinking about people who told me over the years that the only way you get through A and P is to memorize bones. Right? The deal is to always remember that memorizing the bones isn't the end point. It's the midpoint. You have to have that basic information in order to be able to do that kind of mental mapping and that thinking about how do I understand systems. How is it that someone winds up looking at a condition and saying, this doesn't feel right? And it takes a while to get back to articulate what's wrong, and you'll eventually go back to that memorization piece to do the actual sorting out. But there's a level of information that's in there. Now, I'm very much in favor of those medical schools who have been moving away from never dealing with patients in the first 2 years of med school. I mean, there's been a significant move across the country of doing much more patient-centered teaching at med schools so that you don't get that stark separation. And people are asking from the beginning in med school, here is how that thing I learned relates to this lady's kidney. And so that's part of the transition. Yeah. What else? Yes.
Balancing spiritual growth with academic growth. Personally, I feel it's difficult, and this environment, being a Christian institution, I feel is more understanding. But I mean, I can think of numerous occasions where, instead of writing a paper, I'm up all night having a serious spiritual conversation with someone.
Yes.
And then I don't get my paper done.
Yeah.
But there's, been a victory for someone else.
So couple of thoughts. One, and this is actually kind of where I begin my book. But one is to recognize that you're learning spiritual lessons when you're sitting in the anatomy and physiology class. You don't always know it, but sometimes it will just strike you and say, I never thought about this that way. Nobody has to tell you that. So some of my answer is about separating those boundaries. Right? Second part of my answer is if you know that's a pattern, then you got to change your scheduling a little bit so that you started the paper a few hours early. But try not to be mean there. And the third thing I'd say to that is sometimes that conversation with the roommate who's in crisis is worth the B- on the paper. And you just say, I could have done a better job on that paper, but I made a choice. I turned the paper in, it wasn't my best work. I think I made the right choice because my roommate needed me. And so it removes some of that pressure and tension between seeing those as alternative issues. It doesn't work quite as well if you're up all night, but there's some boundary issues there as well. That's good though. It's sometimes in a Christian institution, we wind up pitting the spiritual against the academic more than we should. And we need to see if all of life is about learning, if every venue we're in is about the possibility of doing the work of learning, that's true spiritually as well as academically. So we need to blow away those boundaries and see that all of that is possible. Okay, I got time for one more question. Yep.
Here's a thought. What if every grade was primarily based on participation?
Primarily based on okay. When every grade was based on participation, how would you respond to the student who talks a lot but didn't necessarily read the material or wasn't contributing to moving the conversation forward? We'd have to think about, I think you're right, but I think we've got to think about what participation means. Because the way we talk about participation, it too often means that if you're a very verbal person who likes to share, you're going to do well. And if you're a deep thinker who's got a really kind of outstanding level of intrapersonal intelligence, you process stuff. And you would be ready for great comments about half an hour after the class was over. So we've got to think about how to play that in there. I do think that the notion about making education more about our engagement together and less about what I say, in spite of the fact that I talked for 40 minutes, is more the direction we need to head. Okay? All right, thank you very much. I'd love to talk about this. I'd be glad to talk further.